Poetry Center, bringing poetry to Paterson since 1980 at Passaic County Community College.
Hi, I'm Maria Mazziotti-Gillen. I want to thank the New Jersey State Council on the Arts for supporting us, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Passaic County Community College, particularly the president of Passaic County Community College, who's been very supportive of our programs, and individual donors and people who left us money in their wills. So I'm appreciative of all those donations, whether they're $25 or $10,000. We really need all the help we can get to keep our programs running. So I'm always happy to see that. If you have not already signed up for the open reading and you'd like to read in the open reading, go see the young woman with the books, and she'll sign you in. Cynthia is my new assistant, basically. And I want to thank her and Sue Balick, who does an awful lot of the paperwork involved with the grants. If anybody's ever gotten a grant, you know how many reports, budgets, and all the rest of it have to be filled out in order to keep getting the grants. So I have to say that I'm very happy that I have Sue Balick, because she's very good at that, very good at it. Anyway, today we're pleased to welcome Nicole Cooley and Meghan O'Rourke as our two featured readers. And I'm going to have Nicole go first. She grew up in New Orleans and is the author of 7 books of poetry. Most recently, Mother, Water, Ash from Louisiana State University Press, as well as Of Marriage, Alice James Books, Girl After Girl After Girl, LSU Press, Breach, LSU Press 2010, and other collections. She's also published 2 chapbooks and a novel. She has received the Walt Whitman Award from the Academy of American Poets, the National Endowment for the Arts grants, and the Emily Dickinson Award from the Poetry Society of America. She teaches in the MFA program in creative writing and literary translation at Queens College, City University of New York, and lives in New Jersey with her family. Did I ask you where in New Jersey you live?
Glen Ridge.
Oh, Glen Ridge, okay, near Montclair. Yeah. Very good. So let's welcome Nicole Cooley this morning, and I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we have an audience.
Thank you, Maria, and what an honor to read with Meghan, and how much fun did we have this morning in our generative workshop. It was excellent. So I'm going to read some poems from my new book, Mother, Water, Ash, which came out in the fall, and then I'll conclude with some poems from a new manuscript I just finished, which is about trash. So a couple things about this book. A little small shout out, though of course she's not here, to the New Orleans artist Sybil Peretti, whose image graces the cover. I really wanted to have a living woman artist from New Orleans be on the cover of my book, and I really love this. So just shout out to her. And I'll just start by reading the first poem in the book. And I think all you need to know is that, so this book is very much inspired by my mother's sudden death in 2018. And I said this in my workshop this morning, but I think I'll just say it again because everybody here's a writer. So the way I write books in such a weird way. My mother died suddenly. I came back from New Orleans and I just started writing. And I never sit down to write a poem with a capital P. I always am writing towards something. So I was just like, I'll just write. I don't know what I'll write. And I was just typing up notes. I didn't even print them out. And I looked down, I was like, oh my God, I have 50 pages of stuff. And P.S., like 99% of it is terrible, but that's fine. So then I'm like, oh, 99% of it is terrible, but there's stuff that I can form into poems. And I began looking through this 50-page mess of slop, and I was like, oh, I see the obsessions. I see what's happening. I see what I'm thinking about. And the book started to take shape. And obviously, there were many, many, many years and revisions since then. But it's kind of interesting that was the story. That was the way it began, which is kind of how I work. I'm a very messy writer. So, in the process of writing those 50 pages, I realized that not only was this book about my mother's death, but it was about the state of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, where I grew up, because my mother is very linked in my mind to Louisiana, Hurricane Katrina, and the disappearance of the coast. And so you'll see that in here too. So before I read the first poem, I guess I'll just say that I grew up 2 blocks from the Mississippi River levee. And this poem is called, "On the Mississippi River Levee, Styrofoam Cup in My Hand. That will disintegrate in 500 years. I drink my coffee, stand in gravel in my church skirt, black velvet I wore to my mother's funeral 11 days ago. Take a photo of my own shadow on the railroad tracks to Snapchat to my daughters. While this river outside my parents' house is rising higher than in years. Spillways opened, live oaks sunk in mud, grass littered with plastic bags and beer cans. Levee trash, a photo essay, my former self might think. That self so well versed in irony, that careful daughter who would take notes, then shut her notebook. Now on the levee, a white truck speeds by too fast. Maybe a man who picks up shifts on rigs for extra money. And in a former life, I'd write a poem about how that man might be dangerous to my daughters. Now I write nothing. I'm here to walk off my restless sadness, to walk off my mother's voice years ago after the storm when the city flooded, telling me she will never leave New Orleans, no matter how high water rises or how many times levees breach, telling me she will die in her house, no evacuations, no hospitals. Now I know grief has its own typography. Mine is this city and this coast. So we were talking about obsessions this morning in my workshop, and it's so interesting. I remember the poet, Philip Levine always talking about Detroit was where he returned to. Poet C.D. Wright talking about how Arkansas was where all her poems always returned to. And I began to realize that New Orleans, even though I don't live there now, is where my poems are all returning to. So everybody has a place like that, right? Or maybe more than one place. It's just interesting to think about. I want to read another poem from the book, which is about the coastline. And so Hurricane Katrina, as you all know, hit the Gulf Coast on New Orleans on August 29th, 2005. Unbelievably, 16 years later, Hurricane Ida hit the Gulf Coast on August 29th as well. And it was like, really, unbelievable, but also, yes, believable. And in both situations, what happens with these hurricanes is that the Mississippi starts flowing the other way. So that's in the poem. But I realized when Ida hit, and my mother was no longer alive, my father was in New Orleans, it really brought back a lot of the thinking that I had around Katrina. So this poem speaks to that, and it's called 16 Years to the Day Another Hurricane Reverses. The Mississippi's Course. My father waits in our house beside the river, and I dream my mother drowning, water closing over her head. In my dreams, she is always dying in the too warm Gulf, then pricked alive, fairy tale spindle. My friends and I text each other to describe dreams in which our mothers ask us why they're dead. New Orleans is the place around which I uselessly orbit. After Katrina, typing my mother's name, missing person Jackie Cooley, into search engines. 16 years ago, my daughters asked, what is a hurricane's eye? What can it see? Then my mother was alive, refusing to leave the city. Now I text my father. How high is the water? Are there tornadoes? Phone and electric out. I wish for a slick of river to spare our house, while in a new dream about my mother, she thrashes to the Gulf's sand floor where she can't burn or come apart. So I'm really interested in, and I said this in my class this morning as well, triggering objects. And I think it's especially fascinating to me how clothing brings back people, or I still have a bunch of my grandmother's clothing, which is in great shape, by the way, better than like what I would buy at Old Navy. And I wear it all the time. And I also have a bunch of my mother's clothing, and this poem is about that, sort of clothing as talisman and remembrance. It's called My Mother's Nightgowns Smell Like Smoke. White cotton with buttons the size of baby teeth. Each morning, in one of her nightgowns and my black winter boots, I drive my daughters to school. And as they climb out of the car, I want to crawl out of my own skin, everything prickly and hesitant. I'm on the elliptical trainer at the YMCA beside my younger daughter who wears a black Thrasher t-shirt. She doesn't skateboard, doesn't live in California. And a few days later, on my way to fly to my father after my mother dies, I see many teen girls in the airports I pass through wearing that exact shirt. Skateboarding is a dangerous sport. You could break bones, I cautioned my daughters that night from New Orleans on the phone, as I sit on my parents' bed, in the house without my mother, as if now I could protect anyone's fragile body. We called them the guilt skirts, the 3 skirts she sewed for me when I broke up with my graduate school boyfriend and she knew she didn't help me when I cried. She mailed me skirts instead, one with flowers, one green, one gray. I never wore them. Now the skirts hang bunched in my closet beside my daughter's abandoned prom dress. In New Orleans, my mother has been dead for 3 days, and I wake up and my hands are shaking, and my sister and I drive to the Salvation Army Family Store on Jefferson Highway and drop off another trash bag of her clothes. It's my happy place, I tell my sister, and I'm being ironic and using humor as a coping mechanism, as at least one grief podcast recommends. But it's also true, and she agrees as we finger racks of dresses. We can't leave till I find something that is a channel back to her. In the dressing room, I sweat through velvet in someone else's too tight blouse. The fake French cafe where I have disappeared to write about my mother in Brooklyn is advertising Bastille Day specials. And I remember Bastille Day in New Orleans in 1976, how my mother sewed my sister and me can-can dresses, satin and rainbow net to kick up in ruffled layers. All summer, we wore the dresses every day and slept in them, in our twin beds, in our girl bodies, when we were still daughters. So another thread that floats through the book that you might have guessed already is about smoking, which is what killed my mother. And this is a poem about an ashtray. And it's an ashtray which I still have under the couch in my New Jersey house on the porch. I can't seem to get rid of it, and the poem is about how I still have that ashtray. It's called My Mother's Ashtray. My mother's ashtray, with the last of her DNA, gold clamshell I snapped shut, now shoved under my couch to avoid, also to save. While I want my mother to return to offer me a list of how I failed to snip a strand of her hair at the funeral home for safekeeping, how I never wore the skirts she sewed, how when she visited to help with my babies, I refused to let her smoke in the house, demanded she sit on the cold porch with her ashtray. Without her now, I am back at the dark corner of myself, the old urge to step out of my body, drop it on the floor like a crumpled dress. As I lie on the floor of my daughter's room, she's fevered and finally asleep, too old for this. In the middle of the night, I will my mother to come back, to slip the ashtray out from underneath the couch. Ashtray I won't empty. Should I save the butts her lips once touched, their own museum exhibit? She won't return, which means I fail my mother. I know she kept the ashtray secret from my daughters under the couch, ashed and ready, just as I collect my teenage daughter's baby clothes in a box. Ruffled toddler dress, blue sleep sack, just as I wear her black raincoat now, as if my body could ever be equivalent to hers. I flip the ashtray open like a beer can or a jewelry box, a bed warmer to be held against a hearth fire. I research ashtrays on eBay to avoid myself, to not finish this poem in which my mother is finally dead and I have the evidence in my house, this stick handle like a wrist. So I'm gonna read one more poem from this book and then move on to trash. This is, I guess I read a lot about objects. I'm realizing as I read these poems, and this poem is called After My Mother Dies, I Crave the 70s. First, the foods. Deviled eggs scattered with paprika, a Bloody Mary, celery stuck in the center of the glass, a cheese log studded with cloves, a bowl of green goddess dressing, all of the decade's weird nourishment, foods I never ate as a child. Yet now I ache stupidly for the cold orb of that egg, its shirred and dusted yolk. And then I want to go running in the New Orleans park with a Walkman, sweaty styrofoam slipping from my ears, rectangular weight in my hand. I want to dial a rotary phone and call my mother back. And when I find her, she and I will watch Clute and Midnight Cowboy together on our green and yellow fiberglass couch. Crave, meaning from the Old English, ask, implore, demand by right. My mother and I are back at the Winn-Dixie on the highway, and she is younger than I am now, and I am asking for a mood ring from the gumball machine. Crave, perhaps related to craft in its base sense of power. And I want my mother to be my sister, which is ridiculous, as I have a sister, and I'm raising two sisters in my other life as a mother. Meanwhile, I'm back in our living room in New Orleans, and my mother and I are shoving the particle board bookcases against the wall and flipping open our tab cans. I want my cheap acrylic turtleneck back. I want my IBM Selectric to type my middle school papers, my Betamax, my 8-track tapes, my early Billy Joel. After we rearrange the living room in the hopes of changing our lives, my mother and I fold a paper fortune teller together and I quiz her. Yes, no, maybe. She gives no good answers. After all, she's back from the dead. In the other world, which is this one, my daughters have the box of my parents' Ouija board and are scooting the planchette over cardboard late at night while my husband and I sleep upstairs. Crave, meaning to long for, eagerly desire, to ask very earnestly. Deviled eggs were first made in ancient Rome, where it was said, from eggs to apples, meaning from beginning to its end, in the course of a meal. Eggs, the color of the couch my mother and I sat on when I believed she would never die.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm gonna finish. I'm gonna conclude by reading some poems. So I spent, during the pandemic, like a lot of us, I spent my time obsessively walking. And because I live, and everyone will appreciate this being in New Jersey, like I live in Glen Ridge, which like you can walk in like 10 minutes to Montclair and Bloomfield. And if you walk farther, you're in like, anyway, you can get to a bunch of towns within an hour. So I began frantically and obsessively exploring my neighborhood. And it was very fascinating. I learned a lot. But I walked and walked and walked. And I didn't want to look at people's beautiful gardens. And it wasn't an especially beautiful spring, 2020. And so I stared at the ground. And I began to make lists on my phone of trash and things I saw on the ground. And like, I would just like literally list the trash. And then I would come home and be like, oh, I have this list of trash. And I would write something about it. So then I became really fascinated by trash. And I started thinking, where does my trash go? And then I realized it's actually being burned. All of our trash is being burned to the Covanta incinerator in Newark, which it was shocking. That's like 5 miles from my house. And then I said, where does the trash in New York go? And it became this giant research project that I then spent the last year and a half researching and writing about, because the world doesn't need a book of poems about what trash I see on the sidewalk in New Jersey, but there is a really fascinating history of trash with the Department of Sanitation in New York and trash in New Jersey. So I began writing these poems and researching them, and it was really, really interesting, and I learned a lot. I started composting. which is good. And I'm just going to read a couple of poems from this new project. The book is called Trash. I just finished it. And I guess I'll start with one of the early poems in the book, which is called Trash Definition. Trash and garbage not the same, nor is awful, nor is sewage. See my childhood house wedged between a highway and a river strewn with styrofoam. See also separate the dry, paper, wood, bottles. Garbage is wet organic matter. See 2020, discarded masks, gloves on the sidewalk. We're not to touch anything now. See also construction debris, ash, street sweepings. See Katrina's aftermath, houses water-lined, furniture dragged to the sidewalk. Also slop, also manure. Or the word filth, which I have always found beautiful. We are the world's most wasteful nation. See the too hot Mississippi run with chemicals, Gowanus Canal scattered with cans. See also save and discard. See burn and bury. Trash is our best export after oil. See microplastics, nanoplastics, nurdles lodged in our bodies. See 2020, daughters disinfecting groceries, pitching wipes in a bucket. See miasma, also much too lovely. Discard or save, who will decide? Trash, not trash, until we name it so. So another thing I recently started doing when I was working on this project is writing letters to incinerators and landfills, which is kind of interesting. And thinking about what an incinerator actually is. They don't want to call them incinerators anymore. In fact, the Covanta incinerator is actually not called the Covanta incinerator. It has a rebranded name, which I can't remember because it really is an incinerator. And so I have these like short little letter poems in the collection, and I'm gonna read one of those. Dear incinerator, dear combustion, in the other century you were a burn pit, then called a destructor. You were preferred to ocean dumping. How are you now an energy source rebranded? You are a thermal oxidizer. How high a temperature to burn pathogens and hazardous waste? Is there such a thing as an environmentally healthy incinerator? How are you renewable? What about residual waste streams? What about air particles? What about grate siftings? Fly ash, bottom ash, dioxins, chlorides, halides? What about fugitive emissions? What about waste recuperation? What is high ash fraction? Okay, and I'm going to conclude with a slightly longer poem, which is using a form I really love, the Japanese form, the zuhitsu, which is kind of a cross between creative nonfiction and poetry. And it's Japanese for running brush, and it's just sort of a little bit like a lyric essay, but it allows you to bring a lot of things together. And this poem is called Fast Fashion. So one of the horrifying discoveries among many during my research was that that fashion is like one of the primary things polluting our planet. And I started reflecting on that, and really thinking about it and researching it and reading about where our clothes come from. So this poem has some quotes, which are from documents about the fashion industry, and it has a little bit of history. And here's my last poem. Fast Fashion, a zuhitsu. My skirt, menthol green. My skirt, a shard of light. My skirt, a mouth. I write another note. I research for comfort and relief. Picture a factory backlit. Girl at a window holding a bolt of fabric. How many of you are wearing plastic? I asked my class. The answer, of course, is everyone. Skirt I smooth over my hips, pleats and waist stitched by a child. The fashion industry accounts for 10% of annual global carbon emissions, according to statistics from a March 23rd report by the UN Environmental Program. The report also found that the amount of garments produced today has doubled since 2000. with consumers buying an estimated 60% more clothes today, but only wearing them for half as long. Wearing this skirt, I feel. Hashtag who made my clothes? Hashtag textile waste. Hashtag buy less, wear longer. When did fashion become an engine of destruction? My daughter says, here is my dress I bought online, it cost $5. And at first I praise her thrift until I yank the violet sundress from the dryer and it shreds in my hands. In 2013, Rana Plaza in Bangladesh collapsed, a building containing multiple clothing factories, a building known to be strewn with cracks in its walls and foundation, a building where 1,134 people died who make our clothes, a building owned by a man who forced everyone back to work the day after the cracks were discovered. Call an outfit a fit, my daughter reminds me with a hint of disgust. Supply chain fact. When we wash our plastic clothes, our crude oil clothes, our polyester, our rayon, our nylon, microplastics shed into the waterways. In my closet now, I will always keep my mother's striped t-shirt, my grandmother's red cloth button jacket, my skirt, a snag in the throat, a hitch in the breath. A river of clothes, my friend and I called it, the trash bag of onesies, t-shirts, and tiny dresses she passed on from her toddler daughter to my baby. Clothes I later boxed and sent to my friend who lost her house in Katrina. True or false? The skirt has a language, or the skirt prevents speech. But while sheep chic may feel like the way to go, the fast fashion industry sees clothes pushed out on a scale that is even too large for most consumers to keep up with. The materials used can last for as few as 7 to 10 wears, according to the nonprofit environmental data platform, earth.org. Wearing this skirt, I feel. Remember that fashion is a business model, the internet reminds me again and again. Not my daughter's halter top or boyfriend jeans. Not the girl scissoring fabric in a factory in Paterson, New Jersey 100 years ago. Supply chain. Who demands, who supplies? Not only does the fast fashion industry rely on cheap materials, it heavily relies on cheap labor, with approximately 75 million factory employees around the world and only 2% making a living wage. My skirt, menthol green and made by a child. Polyester takes approximately 200 years to decompose, I tell my class. Cheap meant something different to my grandmother, to my great-grandmother, to my mother. Cheap means something different to my daughters. When the cracks in Rana Plaza were discovered, the building owner threatened to withhold pay from anyone who did not return to work. True or false? Buying these clothes is a personal choice. Clothing enters the food chain as microplastic. Everything eventually becomes unwanted. To be disposed of. A girl could call herself dirt cheap. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next reader is Meghan O'Rourke, and she's an award-winning poet, nonfiction writer, and acclaimed editor. Is the author of the poetry collection Sun and Days, Once and Half-Life, and the memoirs The Invisible Kingdom and The Long Goodbye. The recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, 2 Pushcart Prizes, and the inaugural May Sarden Poetry Prize, among her many other awards. Meghan writes for the New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, and is the editor of the Yale Review. She's a graduate of Yale University, where she also teaches. Let's welcome Meghan O'Rourke.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank Maria for having me. It's a joy to come to Paterson and read. it's a great joy to meet Nicole and read with her, whose work I've admired for a long time. And our workshop this morning was really fantastic, and there were some really tremendous poems being written in workshop. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, cool. Okay. One of the things I love about reading with other poets is that you discover these unforeseen resonances. So it might be interesting as you listen to hear a couple of overlaps in our work, little images and themes. But the first poem I'll read first because of your wonderful poem about your mother and the ashtray, which was just a beautiful, beautiful act of remembrance and elegy. And this is a poem called My Aunts, which is about my mother and father's sisters. My mother and father both grew up in the Jersey Shore in Middletown, basically, and each had 4 sisters who I grew up kind of being partially raised by, and they were a big part of my life. And this is a portrait of them that's inspired by a beautiful poem called My Aunts by the Polish writer Adam Zagiewski. And you'll hear some resonances. My aunts. Grew up in the, starting over. My aunts grew up on the Jersey Shore in the 1970s, always making margaritas in the kitchen, always laughing and doing their hair up pretty, sharing lipstick and shoes and new juice diets, always splitting the bills to the last penny, stealing each other's clothes, loving one another, then turning and complaining as soon as they walked out the door. Each one with her doe eyes, each one younger than the last, each older the next year, 1 year further from their girlhoods of swimming at Sandy Hook, doing jackknives off the diving board after school, all of them being loved by one boy after another. All driving further from the local fair, further from Atlantic City. They used to smoke in their cars, rolling the windows down and letting their red nails hang out, little stoplights. Stop now, before the green comes to cover your long brown bodies. That poem is, God, which book is that from? I think that's from my book Once, which is very much a book remembering my mother and elegizing my mother, who had recently died. And I'm going to read a few of those elegies in now. And I think one of the challenges of losing somebody wait, I've lost the first page of my book poem. Okay, here it is. One of the challenges of losing somebody is that you lose not only the person, but the person you got to be when you were with them. Yeah. And one of the things we were talking about a lot this morning in workshop is the way that poetry can be a space for finding language that expresses emotional registers and aspects of experience that we can't put into everyday language. So both of these poems are an attempt to find a language beyond "I miss my mother," right, which was the primary feeling, but not a feeling you can go around saying to everyone in your life all the time, and not a feeling, not an expression that contains the entirety of that. So this is called The Night Where You No Longer Live, and you can't see it on the page, but it's a series of questions without the question marks. Because I thought of this poem as being questions that I was addressing to my mother that I could never hear a response to. So the question mark is kind of missing. The night where you no longer live. Was it like lifting a veil? And was the grass treacherous, the green grass? Did you think of your own mother? Was it like a virus? Did the software flicker? And was this the beginning? Was it like that? Was there gas station food? Was it a long trip? And is there sun there, and drones, or punishment, or growth? Was it a blackout? And did you still create me? And what was I like on the first day of my life? Were we two from the start? And was our time an entrance or an ending? Did we stand in the heated room? Did we look at the painting? Did the snow appear cold? Were our feet red with it, with the wet snow? And then what were our names? Did you love me, or did I misunderstand? Is it terrible? Do you intend to come back? Do you hear the world's keening? Will you stay the night? And thank you. And this poem is called Ever. Was another attempt to really write about the entirety of losing somebody. And in this poem, I think as all of you who were in workshop this morning maybe kind of intuited, one of the ways, I love Nicole's description of sitting down to just generate language. I tend to be a really, really messy, I don't even want to say messy, just like I'm free with the generative process, right? If I stop to really edit myself, I might never write. I work a lot as an editor, so I'm capable of editing. If I start editing in composition, you can stop yourself from making really important discoveries. So I like to kind of turn off the editor brain. But sometimes what I'll do as a compositional strategy is give myself a kind of prompt like the ones we were doing in workshop where there's some constraint that we have to run right into. So we're being free, but you have to have a sense in every line, or the poem is a sonnet. And so this was a constraint. I was finding it really hard after my mother died to put the entirety of loss into a poem, and in particular to kind of navigate the line break for some reason was really hard. So I thought, I want to take the most powerful line of grief in the English language, which is from King Lear. And it's when Lear's daughter has died and he's realized that she's dead, and also that he's essentially responsible for her death, right? The worst kind of loss. And he just says, never, 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 never. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to respond to this poem. And this poem is called Ever, and it's a sonnet. Even now I can't grasp nothing or never. They're unholdable, unglobable, no map to nothing. Never, never ever again to see you. An error, I aver. You're never nothing, because nothing's not a thing. I know death is absolute, forever, the guillotine gutting never to which we never say goodbye. But even as I think forever, it goes ever and ever and ever, ever after. I'm a thing that keeps on thinking, so I never see you is not a thing or think my mouth can ever aver. You're not nothing, but neither are you something. Will I ever really get? Never. You're gone. Nothing. Never. Ever. So changing registers a little bit. I mean, I feel like all my poems are about loss in some way. But here's, I've gotten really interested in writing poems to people, which is something you also do. And this is a poem of regret for an old friend, which is a poem spoken to a real friend. It was interesting which friends wrote to me and said, was that a poem about me? I took it as a sign of the poem's success that a lot of people thought it was about them. This is called Poem of Regret for an Old Friend. What you did wasn't so bad. You stood in a small room, waiting for the sun. At least you told yourself that. I know it was small, but there was something, a kind of pulped lemon at the low edge of the sky. No, you're right. It was terrible. Terrible to live without love in small rooms with vinyl blinds, listening to music secretly, the secret music of one's head, which can't be shared. A dream is the only way to breathe. But you must find a more useful way to live. I suppose you're right, this was a failure, to stand there, so still, waiting. For what? When I think about this life, the life you led, I think of England, of secret gardens that never open, and novels sliding off the bed at night when the small handkerchief of darkness settles over one's face. I'm going to read the first poem of my last book, Sun and Days. So my 3 books of poetry are Half-Life was my first book, which was really written in the aftermath of 9/11 and a kind of what felt to me like a radioactive city, a city of intensified beauty and intensified loss and danger. And then my second book, Once, which you just heard some poems from, which was really an elegy for my mother and a kind of elegy for America, too, at the time. And then Sun and Days is a book really about an experience I had of getting chronically ill with no no diagnosis. So for like 6 years, I was very sick and no doctor could tell me what was wrong. And also very much wanting to become a parent and having to, which I eventually became, but the book is written in that space of wanting to become a parent, wanting to become healthy, and reflecting on all this. But I will read you the opening poem in it. And I was thinking about Nicole's wonderful note that we all are writing back to a place somehow often. And I think mine is Vermont, where I grew up in Brooklyn, but we spent the summers in Vermont. And there was this incredible richness to those summers, those fleeting summers. So this poem is called Unforced Error. Once, those long, wet Vermont summers, no money, nothing to do but read books, swim in the river with men in their jean shorts, then play bingo outside the church, celebrating when we won. Nothing seemed real to me, and it was all very alive. It took that long to learn how wrong I was. Over the rim of the horizon, the sun burns. Heidegger wrote, "Every man is born as many men and dies as a single one. The bones in us still marrowful, the moon up there too, an arctic sorrow. I'm sorry, another scotch, some nuts?" I used to think pressing forward was the point of life, endlessly forward, the snow falling, gaudily falling. I made a mistake. Now I have a will. It says, when I die, let me live. A white shirt, bare legs, bones beneath, numbers on a board. A life can be a lucky streak, or a dry spell, or a happenstance. Yellow raspberries in July sun, bitter plums, curtains in wind. I'm just going to open up my computer because I forgot to bring my actual physical book, which you should never do as a poet. I'm going to find one poem that is not in my packet here. But while I do that, bear with me. I'm going to read you one more poem first from Sun and Days, and this one is called Self-Portrait as Myself. So the book is full of these kind of mistaken self-portraits in which I write about myself as it's a kind of prompt I gave myself to organize the manuscript, where it was sort of about mistaken conceptions of yourself that I think as we get older, we see these mistaken ideas we've had about ourselves. But the book opens with self-portrait as myself. And now I, Meghan, have grown tired, have come to the limits of my aesthetic fidelity. It is nearly summer, and summer seems shorter to me, and winter longer and longer, as if life with its inevitable accumulation of grief shifts time the way the myth said, casting a layer of snow over all our losses. I want a daughter, but the daughter I'll never have, I can't imagine more than I already have. I'd like to say, these are the stories my mother read me, and she is gone, and 6 decades passed fast, so much faster than the mind absorbs all the distorted love it feels for the world, all the knowledge it accrues and wants to continue to accrue. And in not being able to imagine her, stop here and feel the light and the heat through the window by my desk, and remember the fields I've stood in, the prickling of time at my leg, the propeller planes hymning past, the daughter I lost by not making her, the RNA, the tethered alleles, the whorls of her fingers like the twisting clouds above, the high impossible voice I'll never hear except within my secret ears. So we were talking today in workshop about image and sense building, and how I read the statistic at some point that a lot of poets had what was called synesthesia in their childhood, where their senses were kind of entangled. So sometimes there's musicians who can see notes as colors. So as a child, I used to hear certain radio jingles and taste cinnamon in the back of my throat, and I heard a couple of things like that. And so I'm really interested in how we take these abstract experiences, like the experience of living in time, and kind of concretize them through image. So we were talking about bringing sense into every line, and you'll hear that prickling of time at my leg. That's the kind of thing I'm really interested in, poem being able to articulate that feeling of, yes, but let me just find another poem here for you. This is a poem. Every now and then as a poet, you get a gift in the form of a dream. and you're able to more or less transcribe the dream. So if I was talking about my process being very similar, I think, to Nicole's, in that I like to let myself generate and kind of write toward something. Sometimes as a book really takes shape, the poems start to come in a more focused way. So it's almost like I've tapped into a kind of radio frequency, and I can start to find the poems in the world. It's one of the things that I love about writing, is it's this act of radical attention that the more you do it, the more it's almost like being a magnet, and little files are coming to you. And I woke up one day and I should tell you that I should not have told you this as a dream, because the key to writing about dreams, which I always tell my students, is not to say it's a dream. So in the future, you know the secret, but you would have heard this without knowing. You would just experience it as a poem. Okay, expecting. I'm 6 months along, and I wonder why nobody told me. I've got red wine in my right hand, a cigarette in my left. There's a noisy party all around me. I put down the glass and lift my shirt. The baby's there, visible under my transparent skin. A little girl wearing bluebird barrettes. I think she's mad at me. What a lush, she's thinking. Her hair is gold, too short for barrettes, so I wonder if they're actually part of her skull. She's got blue veins all under her skin. My stomach wobbles like jello. It's time for her to be born, another guest at the party tells me, and my dead mother helps me lift the pregnant belly off, unscrewing it like a cork. Little girl, I'm sorry. I took no prenatal vitamins. I ate the sushi, which was delicious. And today the newspaper led with a story about impoverished zoos deciding which species they'll no longer protect and breed. But there's room for you. I just didn't know what to think. I just didn't know how to think of you. You'll hear at the end of that poem maybe a tiny bit of Paterson's poet, William Carlos Williams, and his poem, This Is Just to Say, which is the apology at the end. And I have a story I like to tell. This is the best possible place to tell it, which is that my great-grandparents and grandparents all grew up around here, and William Carlos Williams was a family doctor. And my great-grandmother was an avid, passionate lover of poetry. And I have her wedding gift from my great-grandfather, which is a collection of Victorian poetry. She loved Victorian poetry, and it says, Dear Pauline, you know, happy wedding, whatever it says, love Hugh. And she was such a fan of Victorian poetry that she found William Carlos Williams' modernist poetry very off-putting. And there's a famous family story that she delivered my grandmother by breech birth, and he came to the house and saved my grandmother's life and my great-grandmother's life. That's why I'm here today. Thank you, William Carlos Williams. Also an influence on me. But ever after that, she would say, at dinner, his name would come up, and she would say, that Dr. Williams, just a terrible poet. But he's a fine doctor, so we must not say so. So this story is, so I like to feel like I've come from William Carlos Williams in two ways. I love William Carlos Williams' work because it's been a big influence on me, and like how he uses image and this his idea of no ideas but in things, which I was thinking about with your interest in objects, Nicole, and we were talking about today in workshop. So I feel I need to pay homage to William Carlos Williams here today. I'm going to read a couple more poems. Let's see. From my last book, and then we will call it a day. I think what I'm going to actually do is read the opening of the title poem. It's a few sections, so I think what I'll do first is read a short poem, and then a few sections of this longer poem as the last poem. This is a poem called At Père Lachaise, which is the famous cemetery in Paris where Jim Morrison is buried. It's a beautiful tourist destination, actually. At Père Lachaise. It wasn't always going to be like this. You were going to read books and grow up and understand more. You weren't going to bury people. You were going to study Proust's gray-black grave at Père Lachaise and read the note the musician left there. Who was she with her bobbed hair, her violin case? One day you would die, but it was so far away time itself would be different by then. Only time is not different as the years go by, just faster, and it gets harder, not easier, to die. So you practice. Climb the blue and unremembered hills, catch your breath on the bridge between the cliffs, trumpet flowers blooming like the robber baron's wild hair. Your first bike was blue with ribbons. You called her Bluebell. Along Pierpont Street you sped, wondering who Pierre was and where his bridge had been. Were you now riding over it, unable to see the chasm of violet rocks below your pedaling feet? Proust, you are dead, but I am reading your white bones, your black words. I laugh aloud in the French interior designer's soft white bed, eating a pistache macaron. When we die, gloved in earth, we'll wonder why we ever felt a swim in shame. The lawns of June were ablaze, the lawns ablaze. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here by reading a couple sections of the title poem, Sun and Days, which has a kind of climate consideration as part of it too. I don't know if we'll get to that part, but it does sort of bookmark with your poem, really, your wonderful work on, especially that last poem about fashion was extraordinary. It was so great to hear new work. What a treat for all of us. Okay, this is Sun and Days. And it's set in a kind of Brooklyn of the 1980s. You'll hear some cultural markers that overlap too. 1, I tried to live that way for a while, among the trees, the green breeze, chewing Bubblicious, and by the edge of the pool, spitting it out. The book open on my chest, a towel at my back, the diving board thwacking, thwack, and leaving never arrived. Cut it out, my mother said, my brother clowning around with a water gun. Cut it out. The planes arrowed into silence, 14, 15, 16, always coming home from summer over the bridge to Brooklyn. The father stabbed on Orange Street, the Betamax in the trash, the Sasha doll the dog chewed up, hollow plastic arms gaping. Powdered pink lemonade, tonguing the sweet grains liquid thick. I could stand in that self for years, wondering, is it better to anticipate than to age? Imagining a great flood that would destroy your possessions, bathing suits and apples and suntan oil, and a mother bending over you, shadow of her face on yours. It's gone that way, the breeze, the permanent pool, a father saying ghost and the sheets slipping off the oak tree's bough. When I wake, leaves in the water. You could say green forever and not be lying. 2, the pond near the house in Maine where we lived for a year to get away from the city, the pond where the skaters on Saturdays came, red scarves through white snow, voices drawing near and pulling away, trees against the clouds, trying to live off the land for a while. Too hard in the end, my father said. What did he say? Forget it, you weren't listening. He wore fishing overalls most days and stank of guts, our shouts slipping, the garbage cans edging the white scar pond, so many days like secrets about to be divulged. White snow, to stink of fish guts, but to be trying to live, the pond near the house and the sound of voices drawing near. As you aged, you got distracted, indebted. In the hospital around my mother, the machines beeped, the long leads of the heart monitor, drooping parabolas. It's not worth dying for, she said. What was it she meant? Swollen shells, the desiccated brown seed pods we used to pinch onto our noses and skate about, putting on airs. Then the books opened their pages, and with our red woolen scarves flying and the freezy freakies' once invisible hearts reddening, into the cold we disappeared. Evian bottles skitter against the chain link fence. It's gone that way. The green, planes arrowing into silence, gum wrappers slipping to the ground. O wild west wind, be thou our friend, and blow away the trash. Salvage us from the heap of our making, and cut it out, my mother said. Stop worrying about the future. It doesn't belong to us, and we don't belong to it. 3, the surface more slippery, slick, and white the ice. I stand at the pond's edge, gather the information there. Hello algae, hello fish pond, my mind in the depths going. On the beach I dig, tunnel to the hands of the woman who stitched this red shirt, holes all the way to China. It got so easy to get used to it, the orchestration of meaning against the night, life a tower you could climb on, not a junk heap, pale picture books yellowing on the shelves. It got so... I close my eyes and walk along the hospital hall, the iris quivering in the March light, a nurse taking my mother's pulse, not paid enough to help us as we wished to be helped. And your hope left behind, turning the pages of magazines, the models in Prada and Gucci. As a girl, it was a quest to feel exploded every second, pudding pops and Vietnam vets standing on the corner shaking their styrofoam cups. Holding her cup, my mother stands, petting the dog. It's 1982, the sun tunneling in. She drinks her coffee. Cut it out, or forget it, or hello. Look, Mom, I've made a telephone for us. Put that cup to your ear, and I'll put it to mine, and listen. I just need to find one of those styrofoam cups. And what about you? Where did you go? What kind of night is it there? Electric, synthetic, blackened, or burnt? I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening.
Wonderful. Let's give another round of applause for our two poets. Tremendous readings tonight. And it's funny how they kind of talk to each other. So that was a wonderful thing to happen. And now we're going to start doing the open, and I'll ask you to come up to the stage, and I'll call your name, and I'll ask you to come up to the stage and read your poem. The first person is Tara Temprano, who is from my neighborhood. Good to see you, Tara. I'm glad you came back.
Yes, ma'am. And I purchased your book.
Oh, good.
And I wrote a poem from one of your prompts.
Oh, good.
Okay, on page 100 of Maria's book, page 100, she asks to write a poem with the first words, "I wanted to scream." So, I wanted to scream, but no noise escaped my mouth. My vocal cords, strangled by fear, sent silent tremors through my body. The sound swelled inside me, rising from my stomach, climbing the summit of my 20-something frame, but it never broke free. My heart pounded like a war drum, each beat a desperate signal echoing in my ears. Stop, please stop. My mind screamed, but the words were prisoners trapped behind my teeth. The world stuttered, paused mid-motion, a wave of numbness drowning me whole. I wanted to scream, but silence smothered my throat. Their cold pools of evil sparked, gleeful gorging on my stillness. They chuckled, toyed with my weight of my limp body, studied the art of broken things, conquest, subjugation, domination, a vivacious woman reduced to something they could claim.
Oh, wonderful. Congratulations, honey. Bob Rosenblum.
The poem is titled, Dear Horizon, Blue Cross Blue Shield. Even though I made it across the Medicare finish line,
Louder.
I don't hate you. From the bottom of my heart, I hate you. All the denials and partial payments, nothing on the EOBs match the amounts on a membership card. Let's not forget my job stiffed me on picking up the premium. You know, no one is moving to Canada or taking the first inner tube out of Miami to Cuba, where, according to Michael Moore, nothing's ever out of network. I don't care if he's wrong. I hate you. How about a large black wall in Washington with the names of all the people who've gone into bankruptcy over bills you won't pay? Can I put you on hold while we transfer your call to the next available representative? Sure, but just remember, I hate you.
And don't hang up on me. which is really what happens to me. Gina Martucci.
Hello. It's my first time here, so it's been really cool. Thank you so much for hosting this amazing event.
Louder, screaming there.
I got you.
I'm kind
I
of
will
deaf.
project. I'm like kind of a writer. I only have one thing published, and I just started trying, so this isn't the one I got published, but it's fine. This is called My American Life. Extending the boundaries of the self is something only rubber bodies can do. Prepped and primed for transformation, lathered in alcohol and lemongrass, stored at a perfect 36 degrees until they're planted in the ground. No way to deny that being stowed in dirt is some kind of cyclical event, like the sun coming up and going down. My American life has led to stuckness and dreams of being someone else. But the parts of myself I wish to change have their own minds. My heavy footfalls on hardwood stairs, the buoyant look in my eyes when someone might be able to love me. My hands, accepted as good even if they clap too vigorously, all of this uncontrollable, alive, the opposite of rubbery, a roaring fire of white, a meteor strong enough to destroy the atmosphere, and my chances of explaining to my mother that I didn't mean to waste 30 years following everyone else's dreams. I just thought I'd look better as a statue. That she'd love me more if I kept trying to turn myself into slippers, but my loudness can't seem to die. I wish I could curate art, watercolor paintings, something that flows, a sculpture with carvings never described as loud, but intricate, loving, like The Thinker, Rodin's reverence for thought, recorded down to the very last crease. I've thought a lot and have nothing to show for it but my bombastic laugh, the final stage of grief before I crash into the earth and somehow live on.
Ron Bremner.
Yes. Okay, this one was published actually 3 times. First in Open Journal of Arts and Letters, then in branched out college anthology, and finally in New Brunswick Library collection. So it's called Impacts Persist. Impacts persist. They test the limits of opening doors. Unknown doors open, teaching us. Possible windows reframe the dimensions of comprehension, as if defined by growing ideas. Unbelievable ideas are in bushes that speak, striking the awe that approaches. Form and context overwhelm. There are sometimes words glide at night and glamour in the day. Their spectral voices reappear as bodies prospecting for tomorrow. I gain a glance into the incalculable mathematics of incongruities. You say you will help me to construct glaciers that move currents, the structures that call us limits, spreading shards of continents, connecting mountains to the sea. And suddenly I conquer new fears and explore vistas. Gone is the unseen. Untapped scenarios reemerge and remind that despite all the loss, we have new worlds to discover. Thank you, and have a close of day.
Thank you, Ron. And Michael Ruberfield.
All that is lying and waiting and ever in patience. Beauty, truth, light. Yes, I am disillusioned and distracted and confused and lost. But if I can start a stillness, if, even as I am confused, I can return there is a stillness waiting for me if I can return. the circle light drops of creation, like raindrops of light. I will return and arrive in a first of light, a tenderness right, and though I am lost, I will begin.
Wonderful, Michael. David Haberstraut.
Hammond Street.
Oh, sorry, Street. I can't.
No problem. You haven't seen me in a while. You forgot me. Forgot my name. There's something wrong with society, and money is doing us in. We don't need much at all. There's greed and jealousy running wild, and too many people being suicidal. The media will put anything on the news, on the internet, radio, and TV, all at the expense of both you and me. It's hard to get a date before some ask what you make. Everyone has got a lie. We should all try to save society. We all want to live happily ever after. We have to work together to avoid a disaster. After all, we are the only race, the human race. So let's look at each other face to face and say, let's treat each other with some dignity and grace. We all want respect, so let's start saying, I give a heck. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Thank you. It was a wonderful reading today. Both the open reading and the featured reading were very good, and it's always a pleasure. It's a pleasure to hear the featured readers, and it's also a pleasure to hear the different voices in the open reading. So I hope you felt the same way.